Next, from Springfield, with the recent resignation of U.S. Representative Aaron Schock and the upcoming special election for his successor, we sit down with Mike Flynn, a candidate for Illinois' 18th District House seat. Flynn, who previously worked for Breitbart Media and up until a few months ago never had any intention of running for public office, discusses why he's running for the seat, his thoughts on Obamacare, the need for Congress to address grossly underfunded social programs, and why both parties are guilty of putting their needs before those of the nation. This runs about 40 minutes.
Mike Flynn, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thanks a lot, Terry.
You are a candidate for Congress to replace Aaron Schock, who resigned in March. And let's remind the voters, first of all, it's an unusual election, given when is the primary and when is the general election?
The primary is July 7th, very unusual, just a few days after the 4th of July holiday. And then the general election will be September 10th. So a very, very short window for the campaign and kind of a sprint until the general election.
This is, I think, forever been a Republican district, hasn't it?
Yeah, you know, there might be something in the 1830s, but, you know, since there's been a Republican Party, it has always been a Republican district.
And in fact, Abraham Lincoln, wasn't that his district?
That's correct, yes, he did. He did represent this in Congress. And really, what's been traditionally Republican has become more so in the last legislative remap in 2010, 2011. The Democrats actually made this district even more Republican than it was to make districts around it so competitive, you know, more competitive. So it's probably nationally one of the most Republican conservative districts in the country.
So anything could happen, I suppose, but if, as a political prognosticator, the pros would look at this district and say, whoever wins the Republican nomination is 90% on their way to being elected.
Yeah, you would want a really rich betting line in Vegas to vote in the general for the Democrat on this district.
Right. So why, given that, and by the way, I just want to say there's been a couple, just to remind people, some of the people who have held this, not only Lincoln, but we've had other people who are leaders in this district. Bob Michel held it for a long time and was the House Republican leader in the U.S. Congress.
I think he first held it just post-World War II, probably late 40s, early 50s.
Yeah, he probably had it for 40 years, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
And in fact, Representative Michel, a former representative, is still alive. He's like 93 years old.
And his chief of staff then had it for another 14 years, Ray LaHood, after that.
Ray LaHood, who then went on to become Secretary of Transportation.
That's right, correct.
And obviously his son, who's also another person seeking it. But I don't know, how many Republicans are seeking the post, do you know?
There are three. There is myself, Senator Darren LaHood, and a gentleman, Dale Rentz, from rural Woodford County.
Okay. So let's tell people a little bit about yourself first, and we'll get into some of the issues.
Sure.
Who is Mike Flynn, and how did you come to decide to run for Congress?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. It's one I never, ever planned to run for office. I was born and raised in Quincy, Illinois. My family moved there in the 1870s and started a bottling business. Eventually became Coca-Cola bottlers when Coca-Cola came on the scene. My family were businessmen, on my mother's side, farmers. There's no public service in my family's background except, you know, occasionally answering the nation's call. So I got involved in politics in the early 90s here in Springfield. I worked for the House Republican staff and ran political campaigns for the Republicans against Democrats. I had the what I realized was a thankless job.
You worked for Lee Daniels?
I worked for Lee Daniels, yes, at the time. And my job was to take on Democratic incumbents, Republican challenger races. Fascinating experience, learned a lot, defeated four.
Well, how'd you do? Because were you there when they won the
I did. I ran campaigns that defeated 4 Democratic incumbents. And I think that really set my career for always being kind of working for the underdog and always in kind of a more pugilistic or kind of fighting mode. You know, I've always been a fighter. You know, I guess the name Flynn, the whole Irish thing comes from that, but I've seen it through my career. I left, I got into policy because what happened when the Republicans took over the legislature here in Illinois,
And that was the election in '94.
'94, they didn't really do anything with it. And they lost it in '96.
Now, that was also the election that Newt Gingrich, just to remind people. So it
Yeah.
was a Republican wave in '94.
It was a Republican wave nationwide. It was a kind of a reaction to a kind of more leftist lurch of Bill Clinton in his first few years of his term.
And let me say one area, I mean, we'll get into some specific issues, but one of your themes, I mean, just to let the audience know, sometimes I think it's good to lay out the forest and then they can follow the trees.
Yeah, exactly right.
One of your themes, and I think we can touch on it in a variety of ways, is that you would argue, I think, that the voters of the 18th District are pretty conservative folks, and that oddly, while it's been a Republican district, as we discussed, those that held the office have not been hardcore conservatives. They've been more, I don't know how you would want to characterize them, but not hardcore conservatives, Republicans. They've been more in the mode of Bob Michael, who was more moderate, kind of a Gerald Ford kind of a type.
Right.
And in fact, this goes back to, speaking of the election of '94, and I just kind of fill in some of the background here. One of the critiques of Bob Michael, criticisms of him, is that he was too much in favor of getting along with the Democrats in Congress, that you needed someone to be a pit bull to go after him, and thus Bob Michael never served in the majority, but when Newt Gingrich took over and brought the fight to the Democrats in the U.S. Congress, had the contract of America, said, if you elect us, here's what we'll do. They did. They picked up 52 seats, I think it was, back in '94 in the U.S. Congress. And for the first time in 40 years, the Republicans took control of the U.S. House of Representatives.
That's correct.
So I'm trying to give people sometimes so they don't have to, they get the big picture and we can fill in the details.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good summation of what I'm talking about. And, you know, there was a time, I think, that more kind of go along, get along Republican might have worked. It's not one of those times. You know, I look back when I was a kid growing up and watching my father struggle with the family business in the 1970s. And you had 20-some% interest rates, you had 13% inflation, marginal tax rates, 70, 90%, regulations. And you had, you know, it's funny, you look at the headlines today, you had problems in the Middle East, you had a lot of the world on a knife edge, problems in the inner city. I mean, it was very similar to today. And that changed with the election of Ronald Reagan, who brought in just a very forceful, direct, optimistic, conservative message that managed to turn the country around. But the Republican establishment at the time tried to stop Reagan. I mean, that's how, you know, George H.W. Bush was recruited to run against him in the primaries, because the Republicans thought you can't be conservative and win. And even at the time that Reagan...
Can I insert?
Yeah, of course.
I well remember and was following politics back then, and of course people will remember Ronald Reagan ran in 1976 against Gerald Ford. Almost took the nomination from a sitting president, which would have been unheard of. But I often heard from voters back then, I'd say, well, who are you for in the Republican race? And he goes, well, I'm for Reagan in '76. I'm for Reagan, but he's too conservative to win.
Right.
So that was really the consensus.
Yeah, it was. It was and I think, and it turns out that was wrong. I mean, I've talked to people within the Reagan administration, and you had people like Bob Michael arguing behind closed doors against the Reagan tax cuts. You had people like Bob Michael arguing not to stand up to the Soviets. And it turns out that advice was very, very wrong. And fortunately, Reagan and other conservatives prevailed. And I don't understand what it is that a lot of people in the Republican Party feel that conservatism doesn't play with the electorate. And I think
Well, let me say, I would say what they think would be that, especially in a state like Illinois. Now, you're not running statewide, you're running the 18th district,
Right,
so it would have to be applied to that, and I'm not an expert on the 18th district. But I think they would say in general, especially in a state like Illinois as an example, that the state is not a conservative state. It's been pretty democratic over the years, and for a Republican to win, you have to, as they often say, politics is the game of addition, not subtraction, and
Correct.
that you have to not turn people off, and they think that a lot of conservatives turn people off, if not by their political stance, by their approach, by their pugnacious attitude and their off-putting.
Yeah, no, and I think there are some valid.
Where Reagan was a likable guy. Even the guys who disagree with him, he was a hard guy not to like.
I think often what happens as the sins of individual candidates get transferred to the overall movement. There are some flawed conservative candidates, and there have been in the past, just as there are flawed moderate candidates and have been in the past. I remember at the time when I was working in Illinois, that the Illinois Republican Party became very obsessed with the issue of abortion. And a real belief that you could not be pro-life and run statewide, for example, that you had to be pro-choice. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. Now, you can't be, what's the gentleman's name, Terry Richards, you know, who protests the abortion clinics and, you know, is very radical on the issue. You cannot be that person and run in Illinois. But I think you can be true to your principles. It's a question of what do you make the campaign about. Most people, I mean, abortion is not really an issue because the Supreme Court's decided that. It's not really going to be decided by any legislature.
Well, and certainly not the guy who's elected in the 18th district.
No, no, it's not going to be decided that. So I think, though, that what happens is the Republican Party establishment will go down a list of issues and try to match somebody up to what they think the electorate believes. But any given election is only about one or two issues. It's not about the whole, every issue in politics. It's about one or two issues. And the challenge to a campaign is to frame the campaign around those issues in which you can attract and that people are looking for. People right now are anxious, scared, nervous about the future economically. We have to be addressing that, and the way to address those issues is the most conservative position because that is the position that has worked in the past.
When you say it's about one issue or two issues, it's not about a laundry list, of which I would agree with you.
Right.
What in your mind, what are you running on? What are the one or two issues?
Well, okay, so right now, my frustration, and it's the frustration that has propelled me to run. As I said, I never planned to run. I've never thought about running for office. I am very frustrated that you take Obamacare right now, and starting in 2018, employers are going to drop coverage for individuals with health insurance. That is a feature of the Obamacare plan. In 2018, all those plans provided by employers will be taxed at least 40%. People are going to lose their health insurance. A lot of people that think Obamacare is about people who don't have insurance are going to find out that's wrong.
What is it?
Well, it is about moving people into a single-payer system. That is the thrust.
People don't know what that means. So what does that mean, that they'll move into a single-payer system?
They are going to eventually end up in either some kind of government-approved or government-orchestrated health insurance pool. They will not be getting it from their employer anymore. But each day Obamacare's on the book, it distorts the healthcare market in general, whether it's insurance or hospitals or doctors, how they operate, how they engage in the provision of health care. The Republicans will have, for political theater, a vote every now and then to repeal it, but yet then they fund it. They allow the regulations to implement it go through. It is very hard, I acknowledge, to govern from Congress. You can't govern from Congress.
Right.
But you can frame what the debates are about and what the issues are about.
Now, Karl Rove, most people who follow politics will know his name.
Yes.
Said recently, basically, not that he's still for getting rid of Obamacare, but he basically said to the Republicans in Congress, quit screwing around taking votes on getting rid of Obamacare because it's a waste of time until you get a new president. Which, I mean, to me, I would say seems rather obvious. Barack Obama is not going to sign into law
He's not, but
putting his own legislation out of business.
The Republicans in Congress are in a message war, and they've got to recognize they're in a message war. It's not a legislative war. I mean, you have a situation right now. Look at say the VA scandal, the IRS scandal. Nobody's been fired in either case. There have been a few hearings in the House and the Senate on those scandals. You don't need the president or the White House to pursue those scandals with the vigor that Congress has in its toolbox already. I don't understand why.
Let me jump in if I might, because I think to do you a service. So are you saying, just to make sure we understand, is your core issue at least one of your core issues, and maybe you have 2 or 3 of them, the elimination of Obamacare?
Absolutely.
And when you champion that, as you meet with people around the 18th district, what kind of reaction do you get?
Well, positive and very good. But more fundamentally, the reaction I get is based on a desire to stand up to what's happening. There are a lot of challenges we face, and I think there is a growing concern that our leadership in Washington, even the party leadership, is not aggressively fighting or standing on these issues. You have a situation right now happening today in which the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House Republican leaders are trying all they can to approve and to grant Obama broad negotiating power of a treaty that nobody's read, a trade treaty. In fact, this trade pact, you can only...
Well, where does that actually stand? My understanding was that there's no agreement as yet.
No, it is.
So, I mean, you can't read the agreement because there isn't an agreement.
No, there is a broad outline of agreement. What they're debating is whether the president has fast-track authority to finalize negotiations on this treaty.
It would still have to be approved by the Senate.
But only on an up and down vote. If you remember in the early 90s, we had a very, very energetic debate on NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Act. And the debate was about granting the president fast-track authority to continue those negotiations. And you had famously the Ross Perot and the charts. We debated that issue a lot in the public. There was a very vigorous debate about NAFTA before we even granted the fast-track authority. We have a similar situation, except there's no public debate.
And this is with Asia.
This is with Asia. It's about 40% of our export market. The draft agreement is in a room in Washington. Only members of Congress can review it, not even staff, and they can't take notes about it. And I don't understand why that is so secret.
I would not either.
I also don't understand why the Republicans would be eager to grant President Obama very broad executive powers on negotiation when, at least to their mind, he has not handled the powers he has already. I mean, they're already frustrated with his dealings with Iran.
Well, let me jump in, just because time always grows short, and there's some things I want to get. So you have the issue of Obamacare, you have the issue of trade. You are on international trade or trade agreements in general. Most of the Republicans in Congress, I think, are for this.
Yeah, and I'm for free trade too. I've been writing in favor of free trade for decades. The question is, do you grant Barack Obama, do you trust him to grant him broad negotiating authority for a trade deal that nobody knows about?
Are you running as an anti-Obama person, or, I mean, I'm sure you're anti-Obama.
Yeah, of course.
But I mean, how do you distinguish yourself as a candidate? Why should people vote for Mike Flynn as the Republican candidate in the 18th district?
Because Mike Flynn has a proven record of standing up and fighting against this real leftist assault on our politics and our culture. Whether it was going
you thought other people who had entered the race had not or did not?
Well, I think, you know, first of all, this race a month ago was going to be a coronation.
Right.
And the political powers in Illinois had brushed aside anybody who thought about running. And the seat was going to be handed to a second-generation person to hold, you know, and if you go back, you know, basically a chain of Bob Michael, it's one family has to some degree controlled this congressional seat since after World War II. Voters really don't like that idea. I mean, this idea of a dynasty that just, we are increasingly giving congressional seats to people whose whole career aspiration is to be in office. That's not a good and healthy way to set up a democracy and a representative government.
Let's do this. I could sit here and talk to you.
Yeah,
enjoy it. It's fun.
Lots to talk
but let's
about.
run down a laundry list to some extent, just so people have
Okay.
an overview of what you believe in. So on the question of abortion, even though, again, that's going to be in the Supreme Court,
Right.
but since we brought it up, your position is what?
Pro-life.
Okay. On guns, your position is?
Shall not be infringed.
What on issues, well, on the VA, what would you do?
I would make sure somebody's fired. I would find out what happened, hold them accountable.
Should we have a VA, or should we, I often point out, I frankly don't know why we have a VA system. I say when World War II vets came back, we had the GI Bill, we said, you can go to whatever college you want, we'll pay the price.
Believe me, I agree with you. I mean, I think there's a lot we need to rework. I mean, you know, I think we have an obligation, but that can be done through the private healthcare market. You know, there's no reason you can't provide a voucher for a veteran to get health insurance. I don't know that you need a whole separate infrastructure for
On
it.
issues of energy, now obviously one of the famous issues was the Keystone XL pipeline.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, build it. I mean, I don't understand why you would limit yourself for resources that you have as a nation. It makes no sense to me. You know, most of the challenges we face economically are the result of government action. If our prosperity happens when the government gets out of the way, the idea, you know, if you allowed our resources to be developed, you know, we'd be our own Saudi Arabia. And the economic benefits that come from that are incredible, let alone the peace of mind it gives you in a very unsettled world. It's very different today dealing with the Middle East if you actually have the oil and natural gas you need for the foreseeable future compared to the 1970s when you were dependent on getting oil and gas from other countries. I don't know why we would limit ourselves and our resources.
What about infrastructure? There's a lot of examples where infrastructure does need to be rebuilt.
Absolutely.
The agriculture community, among others, have talked to me about how our locks and dams on the Mississippi are falling apart.
That's right.
And as a nation, we make billions of dollars in profit from that. Mm-hmm. Not to get mired down on the locks and dam issue by itself,
but it's an
just
important
in general.
issue.
What do you think about just America's infrastructure? I will add, I suppose, that I talked to the people at ADM, Archer Daniels Midland, the big food processor in Decatur. They said, Terry, you know, we can go down to Brazil. The labor's cheaper, the land is rich, the growing season is longer.
Sugar-based ethanol is better than corn.
And but the thing is, they don't have the transportation infrastructure that America has. But they said, but we're losing that edge.
Absolutely. No, I agree totally.
So to that end, I mean, because, you know, we often think fiscal conservatives, you never want to, let's stop spending government. What is a viable use of government funds? Where should we spend? Absolutely,
infrastructure is important. The lock and dam system is actually an important issue in the Illinois 18th. That is something that the government has let deteriorate. What you look at infrastructure, one of the problems we have with infrastructure is that we take the Highway Trust Fund and we divert it to uses that have nothing to do with infrastructure. We divert it to things, I mean, 1/4 of the Highway Trust Fund is spent on non-highway uses, be it mass transit or bike paths. Those are things that can be funded, but why are we doing it through the Highway Trust Fund? And what that does is it minimizes the amount of resources we can put into what the intended use is supposed to be. You know, I think it would be far better to get, to the extent possible, the federal government out of these decisions and let the state governments take over this infrastructure. I don't know why we divert so much money to the federal government to then put out to everybody and farm out to everybody, because it's not working.
How do you describe yourself? Are you, you know, some people are Republicans because they're fiscal conservatives, but they're socially moderate. Others go to the Republican Party because they really don't follow economic issues, but they're social conservatives, whether it's gun rights or abortion issues or whatever,
right.
such as that. How are, on those two spheres, I think you're a fiscal conservative. How would you describe yourself socially?
I mean, I'm pro-life, but I came into the Republican Party and I came in a conservative position very early in life, and it was based on freedom of the individual. Let the individual be free to pursue their own passion, pursue what makes them happy, build their life the way they want to live it, not to harm other people. You know, that's kind of the founding philosophy of the United States. We will have government to enforce contracts with each other. We will have government to provide the things we can't do individually, and roads and this. But we should have a light touch on everything else. So I don't know if you'd call that a libertarian conservative, a libertarian Republican. You know, all those words have been defined in different times in different ways.
Well, they've been hyped, and all of a sudden
it's hard to,
become,
you know,
and I don't like so much the labels, but when you're trying just to condense.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. You know, constitutional conservative.
What would you say, because I'm trying to think of people, what people would listen and go, well, that's easy for him to say. He's healthy. It's, you know, I mean, there's a friend I have, her son's developmentally disabled. Mm-hmm. There's, you know, you cover in state government. People say, quit spending money. Well, but some of what we're spending the money on is taking care of people who are quadriplegics in nursing homes,
right,
or people who have Alzheimer's in nursing homes. One of the big issues that confronts this nation, and it's not just the money we've already spent, which is the $18 trillion in debt, it's the money that is built into
what's also the money we're not counting.
The entitlement programs,
yeah,
the obligations that aren't going to be met without a huge amount of additional resources going to the federal government. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, which for people who haven't looked at a pie chart of the federal budget, those three programs take up about 60% of the federal budget.
Well, and Medicaid is the fastest growing. You know, I talked to the gentleman who wrote the Medicaid law in the 1960s. It was very fascinating. Medicaid began as one sentence in the bill that created Medicare. It was an afterthought. They threw in a line about, oh, in states we'll have a program to help the poor and elderly. And that was it. And they anticipated it would cost $1 billion by 1990.
Well, what would you do, though? I mean, this is going to be an issue that is going to be confronting the Congresses in the near future. I think Social Security now, where it ran a profit, I will say, that has been spent. After Reagan, after the Greenspan Commission of '82, they jacked up Social Security taxes quite a lot.
Yeah, and that money doesn't exist. It's already been spent.
And that money doesn't exist. I hear people say, well, it's not a problem because we have the trust funds, and I will remind them, you can't spend the same dollar twice.
Right.
That money's been spent. What would you do about, what would be your overall plan? Not that you have to have a plan, but knowing what you know, what do you think this nation ought to be doing? What should a Congress do about those social programs that are grossly underfunded?
You know, it's interesting. There's a lot to talk about here. First, you can't fix the budget unless you fix entitlements. It's just the way it is. I mean, two-thirds.
It's 60% of the budget.
Two-thirds is, and what those entitlements are basically transfer payments to people. For different things, different reasons, we're basically just cutting checks to people. You have to tackle that. Demographically, it can't exist. Economic growth, if we get growth finally, will minimize what needs to be done. What political leaders have to start doing is actually just having that conversation with people, because it's going to require a lot of changes. And it's going to provide and require sacrifices. But we can't think of it in a vacuum. There's sacrifices across the board. I mean, what we do is, you can't be talking about we're going to sacrifice and call for things in entitlements, but then continue like corporate welfare and subsidies and these other programs. You've got to look at the whole thing. There are things that absolutely have to be done. I was talking to the former sheriff of McLean County, and criminal justice reform is a big focus of mine. I think we have to do that.
In what direction? Give us a little flair for what would you do?
Well, you cannot just keep incarcerating people. It's not getting to the heart of the problem. The mandatory minimums are insane. It's a crazy system. But you know, he was talking to me, and he's like, the fundamental problem is mental health. Mental health, substance abuse.
Such as the fellow, and I forget his name, who's been found guilty of the murder out in the theater in Colorado. Who,
Right.
To my way of thinking, when you just look at this guy, he's obviously
Yeah.
insane. We have the more other, I forget the name of the individual, that was the Sandy Hook Elementary shooter.
Loeffler.
Who everyone knew was,
crazy.
his mother knew, and everyone knew he has been suffering from mental illness for some time.
Right, and so, I mean, there are, and there are things government needs to spend money on and do, but it's to put the right focus on. I mean, the whole problems we have in criminal justice right now have been because we've had politicians that basically just go around and campaign and say, we're going to lock everybody up, or we're going to have, you know, we're going to be tough on crime and mandatory minimums, 3 strikes you're out. And it sounds good in the campaign, but that doesn't solve the problem. You know, you've got to, you got to get to the heart of the problem. And we've had too much of that for decades, of just these simple answers. You know, don't touch my Social Security. Well, no, we're not going to, but we really have to have an adult conversation about this, because it's about to not be there for anyone.
Well, and I would point out, I actually have done quite a lot of research on this some years ago. The irony is the seniors who oppose it, or the seniors of today, they're not going to have their checks changed. The seniors that we're going to have to address are the seniors who are now 32 years old.
Yeah. Look, you know, I'm 47, and I'll probably end up being protected, because by the time they ever do anything, I'll be grandfathered into it ridiculously. And I'm ready. Tell me what we need to do. I mean, the politicians have created a lot of these problems, and that's part of what's forced me to run. I mean, part of it is a disappointment with Republicans. Part of it is a disappointment, not philosophically, but understanding the fight we're in.
Would you say both parties are guilty of those being in office, of putting their needs and their careers before the needs of the nation?
Absolutely. And I can give you a perfect example. You know, several years ago, I joined with Andrew Breitbart to start Breitbart News, what's now Breitbart News. At the time, it was biggovernment.com. And at the time, it got a lot of attention because we launched with some tapes about the community group Acorn, which is a very progressive community organization. And we had, for those who may not remember, the videotapes of... They were taped secretly. Yeah, taped secretly. I forget the name of the individual. Well, we didn't send him. He did this, but we published it. But you published it, okay. But it was James O'Keefe, and he had asked Acorn people for advice on setting up a brothel and with prostitutes, and it was all very sensational. But it got to kind of the heart.
And instead of throwing him out the door, they were giving him advice.
And which was really good advice, oddly enough. I mean, they were very good at that job. But I remember and Acorn has been very corrupt over the years, and I don't want to get into all of Acorn's sins, but they've not been a good force in the American democracy. My point. So we're doing this, and at the time they're on the ropes and they look like they're really in trouble. And I and Andrew both got calls from Republicans and conservative politicians, ones we would know, who said, "You're not really going to keep going on them because they're good for fundraising. We like having them around for, you know, if they go away, what are we going to do?" And I was like, well, I didn't get that script, you know, sorry. I think politicians of both parties have propped up politics over the policies. The good policies is that a group like Acorn has to be exposed and gone away. The politics are, we want to keep this around because people know how bad they are and we can fundraise off them. I think on entitlements, I think on a lot of issues, the politicians have played to our basest fears, our worst notions, and they have made it very difficult for us to move where we need to go. That is part of my frustration. It's not just an ideological, it's that the entire process, the entire system. Chicago just went to a junk bond rating. Illinois' pensions, they're not going to happen. Those pensions won't be able to be cashed. It is going to come crashing down. And we can pretend it's not going to happen, and we can pretend we're going to try to reform it, but the voters know that's not true. You know, I was at an event not long ago, just recently, and there are some, you know, state legislators there, and they were all in happy talk, and we're going to get this thing solved, and we've got a breath of fresh. It's not going to happen.
Well, and I would say I want to, just before we wrap up, I want to touch base and tell people again what Breitbart is, because that's some of your background I meant to touch on earlier. I will say, just relative to what you just said about this not going to happen, the Illinois Channel aired the remarks at the City Club of Chicago of the finance director. She said, "We have the money to pay the fire and police pensions of those who are currently retired. We don't have the money to pay the pensions of those who are currently working." So it is a truly crisis that is not just at the state level, it's at certainly Chicago. Some municipalities are okay, others aren't. But it's also at the federal level. Social Security, we kind of touched on, and you know, we could do a whole day seminar on this. We can't, but where this was a coming problem 20 years ago,
it's here.
It's here. We are just at the cusp of it when we have 10,000 baby boomers retiring every day, and every day they go from being taxpayers to tax takers.
And every day, their life.
And that's going to go on for the next 20 years.
Yeah, and over the next 20 years, fortunately, their life expectancy is going to go up even more. That's good, except for pension and health care systems.
So I would say, from my way of thinking, and as we talked off camera, I interviewed Barack Obama in this very place when he was running, and I have no clue if you'll be the nominee or not, but I do think it's good to get ideas out there, and campaigns are for the people, and we need to talk about issues that matter. When I interviewed Barack Obama, he was not going to be the nominee who went to the Senate. It was going to be a different fellow who had millions of dollars.
Right.
But you know, it's good to get everyone's, you never know what's going to happen, and if anyone would have told either of us then that he was going to be the next president of the United States, I'm sure we both would have fallen out of our chair laughing.
If I had run into you on the street 3 months ago, and you had said, you know, I can't wait to interview you for your run for Congress, I would have said, you're crazy. You don't know what the future brings. But look.
Let's tell people, I didn't mean to cut you off, I did want to get the Breitbart part in, just because a lot of people aren't going to know what Breitbart is, and other people, it'll be a very famous name. So what is Breitbart, and what did you do for him?
Yeah, Andrew Breitbart was a very good friend of mine for a number of years, and in 2009, we together launched BigGovernment.com, which was really one of the first conservative news sites online that only existed online. And it started with the Acorn tapes that we've talked about, but there's been a number of stories we've exposed over the years. Andrew, unfortunately, and he became a real media force through his own personality. And it really was this happy conservative who cares deeply about the country and its values, who recognizes that there is an almost existential fight going on for the country. And that we, unfortunately, are going to have to really fight to preserve what we have. And we've got to be ready for the fight. The Breitbart from BigGovernment.com has grown to a site called Breitbart News, which has an office in London, an office opening in Cairo, covering sports,
and what did you
politics.
do for them?
I was the founding editor of BigGovernment.com, which is the political site, the way it first started. I have, in the last few years, been just political editor of Breitbart News. So all the big sites, there was a big Hollywood, big government, have all just become part of Breitbart News. And I was the political editor of Breitbart News. And I'm now just a contributing editor as I morph to this run for Congress.
And where do you live?
I moved to Quincy, Illinois. I did live in the DC area. But I moved home to Quincy, and I live there now. I did live in several years in Washington, D.C., most recently, because that's where you go for the work I'm in.
Right. And do you have a family?
I do. A wife and 4 children. A wife, Holly, and kids range from a daughter who's 17 to a son who's 9. My daughter's getting ready to graduate high school in just a few weeks. So something that happened in the time machine. I don't know how she got to where she's graduating. Because I remember high school still, which is a little unsettling at times. I think she's going through the same thing. She's fortunately a better student than I was.
Well, Mike Flynn, we could talk much longer, but time's always the enemy, but we appreciate you taking
No,
the time.
I really appreciate being able to have a long conversation about some of these things and hope we can do it again.
All right, thanks so much.
All right, thanks, Terry.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.